It's been mildly sunny, but cool. Thanks everyone for coming. This is the second meme colloquium talk of this year, and we're very happy to have Fran Blanche with us today, who came in from Philadelphia. Just a few words about Fran. Fran is the owner and founder of Frantone Electronics, which she founded in 1994. And it's one of the world's very first boutique guitar effects companies. She's a completely self-taught electronic engineer, artist, musician, photographer, and YouTube vlogger. She launched Frantone.com in 1995, making it one of the oldest web domains in the music gear industry. Fran was also the designer of the Electro Harmonix NYC Big Muff in 2000, and her pedals have been featured in various publications and been reviewed in dozens of guitar magazines, blogs, and newspapers. Fran is also a published photographer, graphic artist, musician, space technology researcher, historian, and mechanical engineer. She has worked on the restoration of the one-of-a-kind Maillardette automaton at the Franklin Institute, and worked on vintage Apollo flight hardware at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Fran's work on reverse engineering components in the Apollo Saturn V LVDC computer got her an article in Popular Science magazine in 2004. And, well, I'll let her tell you the rest. But please help me welcome Fran.
Okay. So, I guess you had a Facebook thing, right, for this, so everyone... So, I guess, have you heard of what I do? I guess the introduction was pretty extreme, but... Are you musicians? Musicians here? Yes? Any, like, engineer students? Any makers, doers, tinkers? Okay, all right. I'll be light on the engineering. That's no problem. So, he asked me to come down to do a talk, and I picked this title, Effects Design and Marketing in the Music Industry, which seemed like a really great title for a talk. And then after I did the basic outline, I realized it would be like a 5 or 6 hour talk, so we're limited to an hour, so I'm gonna kind of compressing it down a little bit. But basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own process for coming up with ideas and designing the effects that I put out under Frantone. And if there's time, I do want to talk about the marketing side, because it's very interesting to me, especially the history of marketing, and particularly how it's changed over the course of my lifetime, which is a more interesting subject, because it's a little harder to market today than it was 30 years ago when the rules were very simple. But for design, basic stages of product development. So if I'm coming up with a new idea for something new, a new pedal, it comes from a lot of different spaces. Sometimes it'll be just the perfect title for a pedal, perfect name. Sometimes it's a motif. I have an idea for, a kind of a look for a pedal. Something's reminiscent of something that I find cool or interesting, or reminiscent of something that is of interest to me, something from my past, like the cream puff was based on Hostess Snowball. I don't know if they still make them with the pink ones, but Hostess, they used to make this ridiculous, disgusting candy thing. It's like this coconut-covered pink, artificial colored snowball type thing. But I thought, wow, what cool if I could like plug into that. What would it sound like? It became the cream puff, which basically looks like Hostess Snowball, but I get a lot of my inspiration from like candy and food and stuff like that. It's kind of a recurring theme in my work. But all these different ideas are coming into focus all at the same time before I even have a prototype made. There are aesthetic design considerations, like how do I want it to look? What kind of color scheme, colors, combinations of colors, what kind of basic background color as opposed to lettering, these aesthetic considerations. Musical considerations, well, it's like I'm making this effect primarily because I want to make it. I like it. It's a sound. It's something that I want to have for myself. That's usually how these designs come from. It's just either I have a need for a pedal that I don't have, or I have an idea for something that could be cool and that I want to tinker with, that I want to try. But so I know that I'm going to want it, but who's going to be the end user? Who's going to buy it? And so I have to take into consideration, is this something that is really usable as a product, something that I'm going to have to sell? Are other people going to want it? And I got to think about, well, what kind of player is going to want this? What kind of style of playing could this be applied to? Thinking about the marketing ideas, right up front. Even before I'm going to make a prototype, if I don't have a pretty good idea of how I could spin it or convince people that it's cool, it might not be a sellable idea, and I'm getting into that a little bit later. But thinking about the marketing and how you're going to convince people that what you think is cool, those are things you got to think of right up front. You have to have ideas for that. The basic motif kind of goes in with the aesthetics, but the motif is maybe a little more specific to like the actual design of the logos, fonts, and stuff like that. The choices of maybe something psychedelic or pop art. I get a lot of inspiration from pop art and psychedelic and mid-20th century stuff, and I'll get into that in the marketing end. And practicality. It might seem like not something to consider in effects pedals, but it really has to be practical. Can people use this? I mean, I can come up with a lot of things that are really off the wall and bizarre, and I have, but it doesn't necessarily make a good product, because if it's too weird, if people don't know how to use it or how to implement it, and especially if it's going to be expensive because you can have it handmade and everything, it's not going to be cheap. Well, it might be a hard sell if it's not really practical, if you can't really demonstrate that it can be used practically and stuff. And will the design fit in the existing form factor? Form factor ends up being a real big issue when you have a company, when you have a line of products, not just effects, but anything. If you set out to make a company making things, you end up getting married into a form factor. It doesn't matter what it is, any kind of physical object. It doesn't even have to be a physical object, it can be a virtual object. If you're a record producer, your form factor gets to be your production style. There's something that you're known for that singles you out. That people, know what your product is just by looking at it or hearing it. It's your form factor. In my case, with effects pedals, any kind of electronics, the enclosure, the inputs and outputs, the way you interface with the product, this becomes your form factor. It's basically the physical shape, size, whatever that you choose for your product that you're going to have to use over and over again, just because it's something that identifies your product, makes it recognizable, and also you get married into it because you invest in parts. If you have an enclosure, any kind of electronics, it's got to be any kind of enclosure. You're going to have lots of enclosures, and if every single product you make has a different form factor, you'll be paying a lot for each individual product, and it might not be possible. So form factor becomes an issue. Well, if I've gone through all these, and I've spent the time thinking about all this, and I still think it's a cool idea, then the next stage would be to make a prototype. And that's when electronic design considerations come into play, because now I've got to actually build it. In order to make a product that you're going to sell, first thing you have to do is you have to build one. And that ends up being a prototype. Prototyping goes through many stages. First you build it electronically, and I usually do that on a breadboard, just basically a piece of copper, it's got holes in it, and just solder everything point to point, like on a, like a kit. And I'll just build it in kind of this loose style, just on a loose breadboard, just to build the electronics. I might, depending on the effect, I might start out from paper if it's something pretty straightforward. If it's something with lots of stages, that I might have to do like a block diagram for the functionality of all the different subparts and how things will interact, and build a basic schematic, and then build a electronic physical prototype from that and test it and then refine it. But after it gets to a point where I've got a working effect, I like how it sounds and everything, well then I've got to think about how this can become a production prototype, which is going to look more or less like what I'm going to sell. To do that, there's all these kinds of considerations. Parts count comes into effect. Electronics, got lots of parts. So usually nothing very simple. Even the most, in an effects pedal, even the most basic, simplest effect, there's a lot of parts. Just because there's a lot of ins and outs, there's hardware, you got to interface with it, so there's going to be controls, there's going to be wiring, there's power, so it's got to be powered, and there's going to be power considerations, and if it's got a DC jack, so you can plug it into a power supply, but then you have to have all this kind of protection there, because people plug all kinds of things in there, and you got to have all this, layers and layers and layers of protection, so that if someone plugs something in there that's really wacky, it's not going to blow the whole thing up. All this stuff just at the start, even before you start adding in all the effects. But the parts count ends up becoming an issue when you want to try to get it into your form factor, because your form factor is your enclosure at a certain size, and if the parts count's too high, the circuit board can't be shrunk down into the size. It might not fit. You might have to have a bigger enclosure or change enclosure, or if your form factor like mine is default like 3 controls and just another control or a switch or something, well, then these are things you got to think about parts count. Through-hole, surface mount, or hybrid. Different selections in electronics you can go. Through-holes, old school, means that the components actually that go through the printed circuit board and they're soldered on the other side. These days everything is surface mount. You open up anything you have in there, you're just going to see these tiny little specks kind of glued to a board. That's all surface mount. Sizing changes, but also component types. So if I'm doing something with vintage components or things that are not available anymore, there are going to be through-hole, and I might have to go with an all-through-hole board. Even if you're making a piece of electronics that's like pretty new, using FPGAs, PIC chips, stuff like that. Even today, components, they have lifespans. So you might design something with a part now, and maybe 5 years from now, they won't be making that part. And it'll be like usurped by something new or a new generation. And the FPGA, the PIC chip, or controller, whatever you got in there, your Atmel, Arduino controller is going to be, now it's antiquated, and now they have a totally different type, or it's all different. So if you get married into the parts, if you're planning on making this product for more than like a year, you're going to make it 5, 10 years, well then you take all these considerations into what you have to buy for inventory. PCB mounting and hardware, this is all, it's like how am I going to fit it in the enclosure? I have certain standards for the way that I mount the boards and such, but if you're just starting out and this is your first product, these are the things you got to think of. How am I going to fit the board in there? Do I have stuff on the board that is going to have to come through the enclosure? Things you have to line up. These are all things we're thinking of. Parts availability, again, it's like you have a design, works, and now you're going to look for the parts because it's not a matter of just going on eBay and getting a handful of parts. You're going to need a bajillion parts. You're going to be producing, so you need hundreds, thousands of parts, and some of them might be. You might be surprised to find that they're kind of hard to find. So parts availability can be an issue. I run into this all the time. My Vibratron runs off a chip that hasn't been made in 15 years, so it's like you're always looking for lots of parts, new old stock parts and stuff like that. Custom parts. Your thing that you're making, you might not be able to buy all the stuff off the shelf. Maybe there's parts you have to make or have made. This is a big thing nowadays because we're in the 3D printing era, so lots of things, if you support any Kickstarter projects or FundMes, you'll see a lot of printed parts, custom printed parts, and a lot of products now using printed parts. So I think, what's the cost of, how many parts am I going to have made in my product? From tiny little pieces on the inside that might hold things, or standoffs, or battery compartments, or full enclosures, or controls, displays, things like that. Anything that might be custom is going to add cost, and things that are custom tend to be quite expensive by an order of magnitude over just buying something, off the shelf. So if you have any custom parts, or if it's all custom parts, that's going to affect the cost, and you may end up with a product that's not really feasible just because it's just too expensive to make. You want to get the cost down. Utilizing existing inventory. Well, if you're starting out, you don't have an existing inventory, but if you have a line of products, and especially you have a form factor, where you're trying to get them all to be kind of the same in certain ways, you end up with a lot of parts. you throw a lot of your money into buying parts that go on shelves and sit there for years. And so you wind up having a shop full of money that you have spent that is just sitting there in parts. And so you always want to utilize your existing inventory. The more, if you have to buy a whole new slew of parts for every single product you make, you just keep adding to that warehouse of money that you keep throwing on the shelf that just doesn't go anywhere. So all of this is just to get prototype made. And if it fits in your form factor, if the board will fit, the parts count is fine, you through all surface mount, you're going to make it fit in your enclosure. You found the parts. You're using as many of the existing parts you have as you can to keep your total cost down. Well, then we're going to move on to the next step, which is the cost. So now I've got this cool idea. I know it's cool. I've built it. I know I can build it. I know I can get it made. Well, now it comes down to, can I actually make the product? Available capital, number one, if you're going to make anything, if you're going to have any kind of project, doesn't matter if it's a physical object, it could be a virtual thing, it could be a record album, it could be an art project, whatever it is, you're going to have capital. And in the old days, it was pretty straightforward. You had the money to do it or you didn't. I'm going to talk about that, about my attempts at the first pedal, which you either had available cash or you went into debt making your product. Those are your two choices. Now today, crowdfunding age, the default is to simply crowdsource it and get the funding up front. Great, but the problem is that all of the crowdfunding disasters that everyone has read about all come from the idea that somebody comes up with a great idea for something, they don't actually build it, but they come up with a great idea for something and they put it really slick video and do a really great funding campaign. They get millions of dollars, and then they got nothing. They can't build it. There's no product. So, even if you go with crowdsourcing, it's very important that you have the product finished. You have to have a working prototype. It doesn't have to be. Doesn't have to look exactly like the finished product. It doesn't have to have all the refinements, all the smooth edges, but it has to work. You have to prove the concept. You prove that your thing works. So you're going to have to pay for that up front with your own money. So when you start out, you're going to have to find a way, somehow, either stretching it out over time or borrowing money, whatever. You just got to throw your own money at it just to get moving. The R&D development expenses is another big thing. If you're doing something that's pretty straightforward, easy, or like making a refinement of something that's already available that people already use, it might not be a lot of time in R&D. It might be something pretty straightforward. But if you're coming up with something really unique, something that's never been done before, something that's really kind of out there, really cutting edge, you might spend a lot of time just trying to get it working, working out the problems in R&D, and that might end up being months, years, and all that time you're spending money on it, on the project, you're eating expenses, just trying to get it working, all this up front. So your company, your product might get buried in the R&D stage. You might run out of money, time, get bored with it, get sick of it, whatever. It could die right there. The new form factor, cost and amortization. If you just start now, you don't have a form factor, fine. You're going to invent it. It's going to have a certain look, and it'll be what it'll be. But if you have a product or several products, and you're trying to introduce new products and have a line, well, if you come up with something that doesn't fit into that form factor, like I said, you're basically starting a whole new company, because you've got a new enclosure, new tooling, new parts, everything. It's basically like a whole other inventory of parts and costs for something new that's basically you're adding to your line. And if you have to change your form factor, which I've done in the past, the idea of amortizing it over a period of time is that, you're thinking, if I really have to do something totally new, it's going to be outside my wheelhouse. Is it just going to be one thing, or can I make different versions of this and kind of diminish the upfront expense over time? I'm not going to make just one product. I make 3 or 4, and that'll break up my upfront cost over a period of time. And then there's tooling, PC manufacturing. These are all the rudimentary, doodah things you got to do just to make stuff. There's all kinds of like specialized tooling. If you make anything, you know, anything, any physical thing, there's tooling involved, and it's not necessarily straightforward if you're coming to it from as something new. There's all kinds of special tools, jigs, guides, and stuff that have to be made to make anything like repeatedly. From like painting, screening, assembly jigs, things to make assemblies that are it's basically like setups, like little machines that allow people to actually do a repetitive task to a high tolerance. So I'll have some pictures of some jigs later on of things that I've done for my own assembly. But these are things that have to be like custom built, things for drilling and assembling, so that people so that people can actually make things. That these tools are specially made just to do one thing to make one kind of a product, and these are the things people have to have. And we're going to have to find ways to build them. Manufacturing of the PCBs, I am like the only effects pedal manufacturer that is making their PCBs locally. No one does it anymore. 20 years ago, it was just the way it was. I mean, you did it locally. There were companies in PA, New York, Rhode Island, that would do your printed circuit boards for you. These days it's all done in Asia. Very few people doing it in the United States, but I have a PCB manufacturer in Philadelphia, and I do them right in Philadelphia. It costs me 10 times as much as having it done in mainland China, but it's part of my business philosophy. Keeping it local, employing local people, keeping the money local. To me, that's an important thing, and also the environmental considerations, because I'm trying to convince people to stop investing so much in Chinese printed circuit board manufacturing, because when they make like 90% of the world's circuit boards, and then when the chemistry is all contaminated with metals and everything, they just dump it right in the river. There's just there's absolutely no consideration for the environment. They're all dying over there from it, but the environmental impact of spending more money to have like something that's like environmentally sound and reclaim the metals out of chemistry and then dispose of it in a sensible way, things like that. Those things make a difference to me. So I'm always encouraging people that if you're going to be in manufacturing, to really find out what your footprint is. Find out what the environmental impacts of what you're manufacturing are, and talk to the companies you're outsourcing to, find out what they do with their chemistry, how they do their coding, do they, how much do they control, how much do they pollute. You'd be surprised what the answers would be. You get costs in, the enclosures, coding, screening, assembly, all these things. These are all things that have to be done, and you will have to research, find companies, or do it yourself. If you do it yourself, you save a lot of money, you get a lot of control. I was a big believer in what they call vertically integrated manufacturing, which means doing everything in your own house. In the early days, when I was in Brooklyn, everything was done in my factory. We did all the machining, painting, silk screening, made our own circuit boards from scratch, copper boards, did all of our assembly, soldering, assembly wiring, everything was done in-house. It's vertically integrated manufacturing. The advantage is that you can solve problems very quickly, you keep costs down. The bad parts are that it costs a lot as far as like space, and it will drive you crazy. But you'll take these things into consideration if you're making stuff. Are you going to do it yourself? Are you going to hire people to do it for you, or are you going to hire a company to do these various tasks and coordinate? And then you have the trade-off between outsourcing to these companies, and then you have to babysit them and make sure that they're not screwing up, and they might deliver you something that you don't want. So you have to have a very intimate relationship with these companies you deal with to make sure that they're doing what you are paying them to do. All these things are things that you're working on even before you're making the product. And how are you going to assemble it? Are you going to assemble it yourself? Hire people, train people? Are you going to farm it out? You're going to find all these. So if you can work all that out, then you have a product. And so like in the early days, I had a very straightforward business philosophy, which was that the product should sell itself. So there wasn't even a picture. There wasn't a picture of me on the internet like till like 2009 or something like that. So I mean, no one knew who I was or who was making Frantone pedals. Everyone assumed it was like this big multinational conglomerate, whatever. And I always decided that, you know, I didn't want to I didn't want to spin my pedals. I just wanted the effects to sell themselves, speak for themselves. And a friend of mine who owned another company, I was having dinner with him, and he said, no, you got it all wrong. He said, you know, the people don't want to buy your product. They want to buy you. I thought that was nuts. You know, he said, no, you're doing it all wrong. He said you should like have your face like on the box. You know, it should be like, you know, you should be selling your whole thing. And it really wasn't until the YouTube age that I even really started even considering the idea of like bringing my own like inner like sanctum into like what I present as far as the business. But that's what I do now. But it kind of is true these days. I think he was just ahead of the curve. These days, it really is true that you are your brand. I don't have to convince all of you young people, how important it is to have your face on everything. So whatever it is that you make, whatever it is that you do, people are going to associate you with what you do, with your thing, whatever it is. You are your brand. So it becomes important that, you know, what does your brand stand for? What do you stand for? You know, for me, being in business has never been about the bottom line. I really need to know that what I'm making falls in with my philosophy of things. What Frantone stands for is what I stand for. You know, trying to support the local community, trying to be as green as possible, keeping low carbon footprint. All these things are important. It's all part of my brand philosophy. And so, and I'm going to bring this in with marketing because it kind of ties in a little later. I'll talk about it from a marketing standpoint. But, you know, it used to be, you know, years ago that, you know, buying a product was very simple. A company would make a product, they put a commercial on television, you buy the product. Pretty straightforward. It doesn't really work like that today. Brand loyalty has changed a lot. Brand loyalty used to be something that could really be dictated to people. I mean, people could be made to be loyal to Coca-Cola or Pepsi, depending on what shows they watched. If you watched a show that was only advertised by Coca-Cola, then you became a Coca-Cola drinker, and you'd have fistfights with a Pepsi drinker over over whatever they were watching on television. So brand loyalty, these days, brand loyalty, it really has changed from the idea of being pressured, like historically. Marketing was the idea of using kind of negative things to convince people to buy products. You would be bullied into buying a product with the idea that if you didn't have the product, you would be unpopular or ugly or stupid or that you'd be in danger. But these days, those kinds of like fear selling doesn't really work. I think brand loyalty today is much more about people will support companies that have business philosophies that they believe in. I think brand loyalty these days, because you have access to so much more information, like just logarithmically more information than was available when I was your age. And because you have all this information, you can pick and choose everything. You have choices for absolutely everything from the 1 million kinds of beverages that you can drink to the 1 million kinds of, you know, audio, you know, gear that you can have. Every little thing from software, hardware, food, clothing, everything, you can be very, very specific in who you choose to support. And your reasons end up being very personal. So maybe you don't buy things just because it's cheap or because you just need a thing and it's there. You know, maybe you think about, well, I like this brand. I'm going to support this brand because they're cool. And they believe in the things that I believe in. So brand loyalty, very important. And whenever you're making a product, the survival of your company is going to come down to the idea that you're going to want people to be loyal to your brand and support you. It's a big part of it. But you can get it all wrong. When you're starting out, if you don't have like 30 years of failure behind you to really be like a brace to understand what the right ways and wrong ways of doing things, you can have the best intentions, the best ideas, the perfect idea for a product, and you can just do everything spectacularly wrong. And this is how it started out with me, because, you know, back in the 90s, I had like no intention of being like a pedal manufacturer. It was just a complete just happenstance. You know. I had an opportunity to make a product because I was a guitar player. I was a guitar player, and I had a need for a pedal because you know, I needed a really gritty distortion sound because I was in a band. Who isn't? And pedals at the time, this is like mid-90s, I really wanted, I've written about this, it's been published before, that I really wanted the big one. It's true, that the Electro-Harmonics, they were selling the gray Russian Big Muffs, which were actually made out of, I only found out after I started working for them, that they were made out of submarine communications boxes for intercoms, that there was this company like in some, like on the Black Sea or something, that made these cast heavy-duty cases for submarines, you know, they need to talk, and they have these big buttons. So they actually made those Big Muffs out of those submarine boxes. But they were like $60, $70 at the time, and I just didn't have the money. So I went to a Radio Shack and I spent $5 and I made this. So this is the pedal I made, and I was working for a guy who had come from manufacturing, and he was bored, and he said, well, you know, I'd like to have a company making things again, and so we just kind of brought in this, and we decided to make this into a product. But when it came down to he was going to like say, okay, we'll make a product, I'll put up the money and all that. Well, then I got to thinking about all those ideas for all those slides I showed you about all the process. Went through all that, thinking about what I'd want to make, and I came up with a pedal that I really wanted to make that had the look, sound, the feel. I wanted it to be something really out there, something that if it were made, I would just think it was the coolest thing ever. And I made this. This is the prototype for the Fuzzy Boy. This was supposed to be the first Frantone pedal. But we spent over a year and assload of money to make this prototype. It cost so much money and took so much time. Everything about this was custom made. It all had to be made by hand. And so I was going to be a custom enclosure made out of aluminum. I wanted to have this special shape, you know, just the right thing. And the base and everything, all the internals, everything would have to be custom made. But even to make this prototype, we were thinking, you know, well, what are the options? Well, when you're casting metal, there's really only two ways to go. You can have dies made and have them cast in dies, and that's tens of thousands of dollars, and you know, it's beyond our means. So we decided that we're going to have the prototypes done in sand casting, which is when they make molds out of oil-filled sand. They basically have sand, they put oil in it, it's like really clumpy and sticks together. And they make a two-piece mold with like a mold for the outside and one for the inside. And you have, in order to make the molds for the molds, because the sand molds are made one at a time, where they just take like a box laid on top of your model, fill it with oily sand, and they pack it really, really tight, lift it up, and it just leaves an impression. And when you do the two sides, you put them together, and they carve little holes in there for the little streams for the molten metal to get in there. They pour it in there just for one casting. It cools, and then they just break the mold, and they've got one casting. And do that for every single one you have to do. But in order to do that, you have to make the model. So I had to come up with a model to make this. My model started out as a solid piece of acrylic. I actually they were very expensive, but I bought two of these blocks with the idea that if I really screwed it up, I'd have to start over again. So I still have one left. But it started out as a block of acrylic like this. And then I hand carved the master. This is the template for the shape. Took me a couple of weeks to hand shape it, file, it's all sculpted by hand, totally symmetrical. This is the way you used to be done in the old days, and before computers and everything. I mean, they used to build whole cars this way. Just they would hand make the model out of clay or whatever and sculpt it, and the car that you would buy or the TV that you buy or anything you buy, it began as a hand sculpted model, just like this. But this only was the outside shape. In order to make the casting, I had to have a three-dimensional actual model of the actual casting. And to do that, the first thing I did is I made an impression out of plasticine. This basically just forms around the outside and makes a negative impression of the way the outside casting is going to be. And then, to make the inside of the impression, I had to basically fill in this with clay, a clay model that would be the aluminum, whatever the aluminum would be. I filled it with clay by rolling out clay, to the thickness that you'd want the aluminum casting to be, putting that in, and then sculpting all the interiors. There was supports and everything, all the interiors, all done in clay. And then you fill that with resin, and then when that hardens, you pull that out, and then you have the resin interior and the plasticine exterior. Those are your two molds. Took those to the foundry, and then they made that. That's the actual casting. So that actually is the representation of the clay that I had to destroy. That would have been the model. So that alone was like 6 months and like $10,000 just to get the casting. And then there was the electronics, because we had to have a circuit board. This is my prototype here. That's what a prototype looks like, and I just do the breadboard I talked about earlier. That's what the breadboard for the Fuzzywites looked like. It's just a piece of copper, and all the stuff is just scraggled on there. It works, but it's not going to fit in the form factor. So had to have a circuit board made. This is the bottom where, again, these are all custom made. We had to hand cut all these parts, and if we made this into a product, every single one of these would have to be custom made. We'd have to have people making base plates and battery compartments, everything, and costs is starting to add up. So in the mid-90s, again, circuit boards. These days, you can get Eagle Altium. There's free stuff. You don't even have to own software. You can just go online. There are lots of PC board making apps that you can just use for free on the cloud. Back in these days, though, having anything CAD oriented, you really couldn't own it. I mean, you had to be a big company to have anything where you could have computer-based printed circuit board manufacturing. So I did it on paper, and so this is actually my rough sketch for the Peach Fuzz in '96, but '94 was the same process where just rough sketched on quadro paper, and this is just, I'm doing a scale drawing, just working out the components and the routing and such, and then I would take this and then do a finished drawing on vellum, pen and ink, which would be like 4x scale, just on my drafting table, which would have all the traces and everything, and then I'd have another sheet which had the drill register for all the holes that had to be drilled, and the little crosshairs, crosshatches, and zeroing and everything. Take all these papers, actual paper, over to the PCB factory, which is in Harrisburg, like 40-minute drive away, and then I take all of my paper sheets and they put it all into AutoCAD, and they make the circuit board, and ba-ding, there you go. First Fuzzy Wuzzy board. But again, that's huge expense. Many months, and not cheap. You're just having a small run of boards, especially back then. I mean, it was talking many dollars per board. So all this expense, and then so there, I've got the prototype together, and it's beautiful, perfect, but we had spent a year, and we had totally just gone into total debt. And the problem was that we hadn't really considered how we were going to market it. And in '94, '95, now it's '95. The avenues for actually selling something like this were very limited. It's before the internet. So back in those days, there were guitar stores, and there were magazines, and that was it. So if you wanted people to know about your pedal, you had to advertise in magazines, a lot of money. And if you wanted to sell them, you had to sell them through guitar stores. And so you had to go to the NAMM shows, and you had to convince guitar stores all around the country to actually stock your pedals and sell them for you. And we had just run out of money. We didn't have the money to promote it, we didn't have the money to advertise it, and after having the prototype built, we realized that the cost of actually building these things, custom enclosures, custom backplates, everything, it was going to cost a fortune to make them. It was just dead in the water. So, yeah, it was a very harsh lesson. I built the pedal of my dreams that I really wanted to make, and it was dead. And my partner was like totally out of it, and but I wasn't really wanting to give up. And so, just taking this assemblage of like the actual electronic design, I decided to change the form factor. It became the Hepcat. 96. So the first real product that I came out with is a Hepcat. Same electronics as the Fuzzy Wuzzy. It's the same design, but totally different motif. I just had the different inspiration to buy off the shelf, so I bought an existing casting and existing knobs, everything. So everything, all the hardware and everything is all off the shelf stuff. And I'm building a form factor that I can repeat from parts that I can just buy readily, get the cost down, and this ended up to be doable. And the motif was changed because, the Fuzzy Wuzzy was like a really psychedelic, thing. I had like, the flocking. The flocking was, I gotta talk about flocking because it's my favorite part. I wanted it, but it's really fuzzy. I mean, it's really fuzzy. It's got like real fuzzy. So, I had a crash course on how to flock, so I was like, without any idea of how to do this, or how to do this, because I knew that like in the 60s there were products that were flocked, because I had stuff, you get like, like a toy horse and it would be fuzzy, I knew that they did it. So it took like a lot of research. This is before the internet, and I found a company that was like Acme Flocking Company or something, and that's all they made was flocking. And so I found out that there were catalogs with flocking. You could like pick it. Didn't have anything like quite the colors, so I had to like buy different colors of flocking. They mix my own flocking colors so I could get the right, get the fibers right, so they were just the right pink color. And then I had a custom mixed oil-based paint that would like work really good with aluminum. So I figured, okay. So I rolled the paint on really thick, the roller onto the casing, and then I took the flocking that I had and used like a what do you call it, like a flour sifter, and like just sifted it on, like and just layer and layer until I just totally covered it in flocking, left it sit overnight. Next day, I kind of pulled it out of the pile of flocking, brushed it off with a brush, and it was fuzzy. And we actually had meetings about how we were going to do this, if we were going to make thousands of these things, and we were going to build a flocking machine, and we thought, well, maybe we could because we had this like little sandblasting machine in our shop that we were using to clean parts with all of them. Buy one of these big sandblasting machines, won't fill it with sand, we'll fill it with flocking. And then someone could just sit there and like, paint cases and like stick them in there and like spray the flocking on there. I realized that if we'd actually built this product, I probably would have died of flock lung. I probably would have gotten flocking lung. Brand new kind of delicacy. So, but anyway, we had spent so much time working out all these problems to make this, and it just didn't work out. So, but the new motif I actually got from my guitar. This is from the time. This is like me in '95. I built this Strat, and so I built this custom pickguard and everything. So I had the logo, and I just basically made the pedal to reflect the guitar. So it was the Hepcat. And that was how it all got started. The Hepcat just kind of barely got through, and sold enough of them that I could make the Peach Fuzz and yada yada. Hepcat worked, Fuzzy Wuzzy did not. And the key was that the form factor, I was going to bring it back. Form factor determined whether or not the first product could succeed or not. And that thing about cost, form factor, cost, parts, custom parts as opposed to buying off the shelf, all this conglomerated into the failure of the Fuzzy Wuzzy. And all of this was really the considerations into how I could build a line of effects that would actually work. And I didn't keep the Hepcat form factor. I didn't like that box. It didn't like, when I changed the Peach Fuzz, it was a different box, and I stuck with the Peach Fuzz box, but then I didn't like the interiors and stuff. So it took a couple of years for me to make a form factor that I could be comfortable with and was economical that I could reproduce and everything. So it took me a long time to find my form factor. But, okay, we're almost, okay, we got a little time. Okay, so advertising. This is something I want to talk about a little bit because it's, I always had like a strange interest in advertising. I really have a love of like mid-century ads. I actually like collect books about like mid-century ads. It's just that there were, years ago in the print age, the print and video age I should say, because television really kind of was the same thing. Because television ads, print ads were kind of the same. During those years, decades, selling was very straightforward. You really couldn't sell anything without advertising in those days. And advertising was really about just the power of the persuasion of an image. And this was taken to a very, very high art form in the mid-20th century. So much so that advertisers were basically selling products because they were selling a view of life, like that you could be happy, that they were selling the idea that you had this terrible life in this terrible time, maybe you lost, people in the wars, maybe your mother had tuberculosis, maybe you had polio, but if you bought this Jell-O, for a day you would be a princess. And so they were selling the idea of that you could buy joy, that you could buy love. And it's such a powerful thing. I mean, the imagery, again, the idea that an actual image can sell a product. I mean, are you really selling the typewriter, or are you selling just the idea of the icon of the image? Or are they the same thing? And the influence is really felt today. This is an ad from the 1930s for a camera that was appeared in a photo magazine. I think you probably agree that this could be contemporary. You could see this for like some kind of for a GoPro today. But just all of the rules of captivating imagery were really honed during this period from the 30s to the 50s. This has been a big influence on me for how to market stuff that I do. This is like 1950 IBM, space age, jet age stuff. The idea of thinking of the future, this forward-looking idea, even coming from the 30s, from the New York World's Fair, the trial and the Perisphere age, with the beginning of television, and in the post-war age where people are trying to forget about the war and really thinking about how we apply all this new technology into making lives better. We're going to have computers that can fit in one house. We're going to have televisions that have color. All these things that are going to come in the future. We're going to have ties. It's like so you're selling the dream. You're saying, well, yeah, this is like the worst tie that you've ever owned, but if you bought that tie, you know what? You get the girl. They don't really sell stuff like that today. And even just the artistic impressions. Again, I mean, this comes right from the Bauhaus, and I'm very much a student of the Bauhaus and Walter Gropius and stuff, and a lot of the influence of the Bauhaus in mid-20th century advertising, it's really there. Not just in architecture, not just in like interior design, but in advertising, particularly photography, because in the Bauhaus they really pioneered this kind of, graphic arts and product photography. It was something that was a very new idea in the 1930s and 40s. So, do you know what this is? What is it? Okay, so sometimes the form factor can be the brand. See, sometimes you can come up with something, if you're making a product, something you're going to sell, sometimes it can be so distinctive that just the form factor alone is the product. The shape of the Coca-Cola bottle, it's probably the most litigious object in the history of the world. They patented this shape in 1915, and Coca-Cola has spent 102 years suing people who infringe upon this shape. But it's the very idea that something like a shape can be the product. And in the Cold Wars, this was everything. Does anyone recognize this motif? You're not familiar with my products. Okay, so this is my form factor. This is the basic shadow of my form factor. It's my arrangement of knobs, switches, and everything. I get a lot of heat for this because these days, how many guitar players? I know you're a guitar player. Okay. Do you have pedals? What's the biggest pedal you own?
Like size-wise?
Yeah, like
the wind,
probably
wall.
Wall pedal. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, like when I started out, pedals were huge. I mean, Electro-Harmonix, Diamond Box, you know, the Neutron. I mean, these were like the sizes of like calculators and such. So when I started out, my pedals were small. Nowadays, with ultra miniaturization of everything, now they're making pedals that are like this big. It's just like the pedal's actually just the size of the switch, and maybe 2 jacks, and that's it. So some people think my form factor is too big, but I protect it because it is my form factor. Nobody makes a pedal with this arrangement of jacks and everything, and it might be inconvenient to some people, but it's my Coca-Cola bottle. So I keep the form factor because you can spot a Frantone pedal on stage from 60 feet away. You don't have to see. You don't have to be able to read the text on it. You can just see it's sitting on stage. Oh, it's Frantone. The jacks on the side, 3 knobs, and then that's my form factor. Okay. End of sermon. Okay. So it isn't that any of this is true, but the history of like marketing ideas has changed a lot. And this is sort of like a just brief overview of like the changing differences in the philosophy between television age and social media age that you all live in today. So these days, advertisers are very aware of the fact that you control your own engagement with everything. You know, you can choose to look, not look, see. You control your own content, you know, what you consume as far as media goes. You pick and choose. You know, I don't even have to ring off, you know, Spotify, YouTube, blah, blah, blah. You choose all your own content. It's not provided for you. You have complete freedom, not only of what, you know, like flipping channels, but everything is there all the time. It's not like anything runs on a schedule anymore. You don't have to go to the TV guide and wait 3 days to see your show. It's right there. It's downloaded. You select your culture, of course. You've got your own specific social circles, and this becomes a bane to people who want to sell to you because you might not be accessible. You know, you can live your life in such a small microcosm. You know, forget about even like it being on. I know everyone's supposed to be on Facebook, but even today, people get into very, very, very specific social circles, right? I mean, you can end up going through your days being completely inaccessible as someone who wants to mass market to you. You may be completely off the grid. And as I pointed out before, your generation is very apt to support brands that you believe in personally, that you believe in their mission statement. In the past, none of this applied. I mean, in the television age, it was so simple. You know, you made stuff, you have ads for the stuff, people see the ads, they buy your stuff. That's it. You know, and it's because there was this. Media was a one-way thing. You know, if you were a manufacturer, you created media. If you were a consumer, you simply just consumed media. You either could watch TV or not. You could either read a magazine or not. That was your choice. You could either, but if you watched media, you watched what was provided for you. You didn't have any choice. You know, you couldn't argue with the television set that you didn't like the programming. You know, if you didn't like this show, it wasn't like they were going to make a show that you liked. You watched it and you liked it. That's the way it was. Culture was provided for you. This was part of that whole persuasive selling thing. The idea of the persuasive image was that the advertiser creates culture and then they sell the culture to you. You then consume the culture that's provided for you. This doesn't happen anymore. And just the simple quid pro quo, you watch ads for things, you buy them. You know, this for that. big differences. So for companies like mine that were born in the TV print ad age, big growing pains in trying to adapt to, try to sell to your generation. How do I even reach you? How do you even find out about Frantone? So these are big challenges. And a lot of the companies that I know that are kind of the dinosaur age, they're struggling to try to figure out how the hell to reach you kids. So, yeah, selling. Kind of at a time, but selling is, there are no real rules about selling, but I've talked about this before, that selling is a very simple thing when it boils down to it. It's something that I call the handshake, which is that if you have something that you make, either it's a physical object or it's a skill or a talent or something you're selling you're selling your abilities, your thing. There are people in the world who want what you have, who want to have what you do. If you think what you're doing is cool, if whether you're an artist, you're an engineer, you're building things, or you're a producer, or you're a musician, whatever, you've got mad skills, you're going to have to sell them. You're going to have to convince people that what you have is worth having. And this is something that I call the handshake, which is that you have something, and there are people in the world that want what you make. They want your skills, they want to hear your music, they want your thing. And it's just a matter of getting close enough to that person to put the product in their hand, and that's the handshake. Very tough to do nowadays. With everybody having their own online social media profile life, everybody's being seen all the time. So how do you get noticed where everybody's being seen all the time? It's a very difficult challenge. Everybody's online, everyone's got a Facebook page, everyone's got a website. So it isn't a matter of being out there, but who's actually watching you, who's looking at you, who's looking at your work? How are you going to deliver what you're doing into the realms and get it within the sphere of being seen by the people who might actually buy into you? Biggest challenge of our time. But yeah, I wish that I could really have like a real easy answer about selling. But I will say that it's the biggest challenge right now. There are so many companies that I know of that are struggling simply because they've completely lost touch with their consumers. In the music industry, like I said 20 years ago, magazines and guitar stores. Well, brick and mortar guitar stores, they've been dying for years, and every year there are fewer and fewer. Because you can buy everything online, Amazon, Reverb, eBay, geez. Guitar stores used to be, like record stores, used to be the center of musical culture. It didn't matter what town you lived in, if you were a musician, your local guitar store, that was your church, that you lived there. You went there, you met musicians, met at the guitar store, everyone jammed on the guitars and such that were there, You would stop the guy playing Freebird every day. But it was the center of the community. Communities were physical things in the past. If you had a record store, a good record store in your town, everybody who loved music was there. And that's how you learned about music. That's how you learned, when something new came out. That's how you learned about different types of music, because you'd be exposed to things. You would have friends who were into different kinds of music than you. That's how you learned. So these things are all going away. So these days, brick and mortar stores that sell guitar gear, they're all dying off, and the institutions that music merch people depend on, like the NAMM shows and stuff like that, they're really becoming very antiquated, because the whole structure of selling gear is broken down. It's becoming this decentralized, internet-based fog. So, yeah, big challenges, which maybe if I find the answer to that, it'll be part 2. But thank you.